You ever watch those videos of these guys just making the most incredible hand-carved leather belts, the Western belts, where you can just see the years of skill, of patience, of experience that they have to be able to make something like that. Sort of comes across almost as a lost art form, or something that's passed down generation to generation. At least that's how I've always seen people with that level of skill. You know, they make it look easy. And that's then why I think those intrusive thoughts slowly begin to creep in. The idea that, well, I could do that. What's stopping me? I've decided that today is the first in a series of projects that I want to take on to kind of explore this area of craftsmanship and to hopefully kind of demystify, or further mystify depending on the results, the skills of these saddle makers, of these belt makers, of these incredibly talented people. And we're going to start that off today with the simplest, I think, form of hand tooling, of Western belt making, and that is with the Basketweave design. And ultimately what we're going to find out in this video is, can a sort of beginner like me create something that is possible, at least as a hand-tooled leather belt on the first attempt? So let's find out. Now I should say I did start this project yesterday because I knew that I would need to leave the belt to dry overnight. So just going to go through some of the work that I did, starting off with some saddle skirting hide. Saddle skirting is an incredible leather because it's essentially an unsplit hide. It's not uniform thickness because it's basically whatever they take off the cow, is my understanding. The way it's processed, the way it's tanned, it's a veg tan, makes it extremely dense, makes it extremely strong, and it's just a really nice leather to work with, but it's not something you're going to be able to use unless you have a way of splitting it because it's not a uniform thickness. Thankfully, I do have a splitter, but if you're looking to make belts for yourself, instead, just go ahead and buy like a 9-10 ounce veg tan and it'll do the same thing. You don't need to be able to split it yourself. If you're only going to make one of these, or if you don't have a strap cutter, or you don't want to have to learn how to use a strap cutter, or you don't have space or any of these other things, you can just buy belt blanks, 9-10 veg tan belt blanks. When it comes to measuring out the belt blank, the easiest way to do this is to grab a belt that you already own and just measure that out. If you're a 32-inch waist, you are not necessarily, in fact you're almost certainly not, a 32-inch belt center. This was a mistake I made early on in my belt making days. You have to measure the actual loop, the actual hole in your belt that you use most frequently, because it's usually a few inches higher than your actual waist size. My understanding is Western belts traditionally have a 7 to 8 inch tip, so I've got a 7-inch on mine. You can get punches for cutting the tips. I actually found that using a bowl, funnily enough, just a normal kitchen bowl, is about the right diameter for this type of curve. So I just measured halfway down the belt blank, and then about, I think, just over an inch or an inch and an eighth down from there, and just placed the bowl and drew around that. That seemed to work okay. One thing I did do on this project, which I don't typically do very often, is grooved a line for the stitching. I think this is important because I'm going to be using some really thick thread, which is going to stick out, and for longevity, for resistance to wear, it's good to have that thread sort of sit down a little bit, and just visually I think it's going to make it look really nice and tidy. And then I'm offsetting from that the border for the stamped portion of the belt. So you really do want some kind of swivel knife. You can get those edge divider things that I think one company makes them right now. They're quite expensive. I would love a pair, but all I did instead was I took my swivel knife, my cheap swivel knife. It's just a basic one from Tandy. And I just bought their really cheap, like, plastic edge guide. I think this was like a few dollars, and that actually worked really well. A little bit tricky on the curves, but for the most part, it gave a really nice edge with my swivel knife that I already have. Now, being this is my first time stamping this type of weave, I've literally never tried this before. I did go through a couple of belts. I did mess up one, maybe two, well, technically one before I got to this. If you have enough material, usually you'll find if you buy a belt blank, for example, it will come about 50 inches long, something like that, and you're gonna have enough cut off the end once you've measured out your belt to be able to practice on. So use that, practice your weave, get your sizes lined up. I'm not gonna go into exactly how to do a basket weave right now. that's kind of a whole video on getting the right dimensions for it. If you want to see that, I can do that, but there are videos online about that. Lots of different ways to do it. Some people use parallel lines, some people use an angle. It's really what works for you. Today I just want to show you whether it's doable. The size of the weave that you use does matter. I like to use the craft tool X510S in combination with a border stamp, which is the craft tool D439. These two work really well together because the sizing of them matches up. Properly casing the leather is an issue that I did have to begin with. Tried a few different ways in the past. Some people dunk their belt in water, some people run it under a tap. I like to use a fine sprayer. And the only thing with this you need to be aware of is that one coat, one go of it, is nowhere near enough. Not for a belt blank of this thickness, where you're going to be doing heavy stamping to try and get a really nice relief. So what I did was I sprayed it, let it soak in. You'll see the water will literally soak into the leather, it will disappear. And then give it another coat, let it soak in, and I did that probably 4, maybe 5 times. And then what you're waiting for, you're not stamping right away. You're waiting for the top layer, the surface of the leather itself, to begin to look almost dry. One thing I did learn about Basketweave, and this might be a bit counterintuitive if you've ever done other kinds of tooling, if you've done proper floral work, bevel type tooling, with the Basketweave you don't want to be hitting straight down, or at least I personally don't do it that way. So when I'm hitting with my Basketweave, I'm putting pressure very much on the inside of the belt. So if this is the center line of my belt and this is my tool, if I'm hitting on one side, I'm not going to be hitting straight necessarily. I'm going to be hitting more this way. So I'm angling my tool very slightly to make sure that the center of the belt is getting a deeper impression than the outside. When it came to lining up the border, getting the spacing right took a bit of thought, but not really too much practice. Ultimately, you're going to have some lines from your Basketweave, and it's going to have, along the edge of the belt, you're going to have kind of like a V, where you've got stamp here, and then you have a bit of a gap. And that gap is where I'm aiming with my border tool. I'm trying to get perfectly between the two, so that I'm just knocking the edge off those two lines, and I'm not creating overlap, where you're going to see obvious lines encroaching into the border, if that makes sense. Again, like this, I think is going to be a separate video if you're interested in fine-tuning these details, but just practice with it and you should be able to work it out. I tried to keep the two sides of the border tool aligned so that each border stamp was kind of in line with the one above it. Not that easy to do in practice, but for the most part, it's kind of hard to tell even if they're not perfectly aligned, so I wasn't too worried about it, but tried to keep them, essentially in the same place. When it comes to finishing the belt, I will give all credit to Gertie Leather Co. I watched his tutorial video on finishing off tooled belts and essentially copied that technique, starting with some oil, waiting for quite a while, and then going over with some tan coat as a resist, and then putting my antique finish on to kind of bring out some of those details. Also made up the belt loop with a bit of thin leather. I thinned it down slightly more than the belt because I wanted it a little bit more flexible. Previously, I've always just cut belt loops straight essentially and then sewed them together, which I now realize was silly and definitely not the best way to do it. I learned this technique watching Geisler's video, which if you watch his video, you'll see that my video is very much a knockoff rubbish version of his, but his technique is to skive off the two ends of the belt loop, glue them together with some really strong contact cement, and then I'll go ahead and stitch those later. The final thing I did last night was to cut a liner from 3 to 4 ounce veg tan. As you can see, I left this wide. I didn't really make any effort to make it straight because you're not gonna see that in the end result, you're going to end up cutting off the edges anyway. And then I used Barge all-purpose adhesive, which is essentially what every belt maker ever uses, I believe, or at least from what I've seen. And it's one of the few solvent-based glues that you can still buy in Canada. Put on a couple of layers, started with a spreader, didn't like that, didn't have any control whatsoever. Didn't have a proper sized brush, so I just used a small one. But ultimately I was trying not to get glue all over the edges of my nice belt that I just spent hours making. Once I got 2 coats on, let it set for probably 5-10 minutes, and then pressed everything together, doing my best to try to stretch the liner just a little bit over the top of the belt. A couple of ways you can do that. Some people put the liner side down and then put the belt on top. Some people do it the other way. Some people have nice jigs, from what I've seen, where you can actually glue the belt in a circular shape so that it's pre-stretched the right way. For the most part, this liner that I have is pretty stretchy, so I'm not too concerned about that. And by making an effort to pre-stretch it, I think once it curves, it's gonna work pretty well without too many creases. I need to introduce you to someone, new member of the family. Hey, who's that? Who's that? Isn't she the cutest ever? I know. No? Yes, you are. Listen to her. She purrs so loudly. Hey. Oh, yes, you are the cutest. Oh, and she wants to go. Here you go. Anyway, that was Mia, the newest member of the family. We've had her for probably a couple of months now, actually, but she was very shy when we got her. She was from a rescue, so. Anyway, what we have after yesterday's work is something starting to resemble a belt. Surprisingly difficult getting the liner on straight, so definitely if you're doing this for the first time, just cut a nice big liner so that you're not messing around trying to get it perfectly straight. If you are just buying belt blanks, let's say you're doing a 1.5 inch belt, which is a standard size, try to buy a 2-inch liner, so at least you have some space to kind of get it on there. So the job now today is essentially to stitch this. One thing to be aware of with belts is that people typically recommend not hand stitching them. And I believe that's because it's not good to have such a long piece of hand stitching, because when you're doing a saddle stitch, it's one very long piece of thread which is passing in and out, in and out, in and out, both ways. And when you have something this long, that's putting a lot of strain on that stitch, and there's a lot of potential for stretching. I don't have a sewing machine yet, and if you're going to be making just one of these yourself, you're probably not going to have one either. So I'm going to hand stitch it and go through the ways to mitigate the issues with hand stitching. And then we're just going to take it through to the end. It's really almost there now, and I'll talk through it as we go. Typically when you're machine stitching, my understanding is you would start from this end here, because then when you get back around, that's where you're going to cut your thread and tie it off on the other side. So you're just not going to see it by the time the belt's put together, because this is where your buckle is. This is the back side. So you're going to start here and stitch all the way around to the tip and back again. Now, given that we're hand stitching, we don't want that much thread in one continuous piece. So what we're going to do instead is I'm actually going to start at the tip this time. Good place to start usually. And I'm going to go down one side all the way to the end, tie it off, and then I'm going to go back with a second piece of thread, start at the tip and go the other side. It's also going to make it more manageable, because if you've ever stitched anything with leather before, you know that you need a lot of thread. The more thread you have, tying everything tight, it's a lot of effort. This is going to be a hassle and a half just stitching one side, but to try and avoid having too much thread that you have to basically pull through every single time, because that's what you're doing. You're pulling all of the thread through every single hole. That's why it takes so long to stitch things by hand. Second thing I'm going to do is add beeswax to our thread, the entirety of the thread, being really careful to make sure we're impregnating that into it. That's just going to make sure that once this is stitched together, and as we're stitching it as well, it's just going to reduce the amount of sort of friction and wear on that thread, and it's going to allow it to slip a little bit. It's going to basically prevent it from snagging, or that's the idea anyway, is to try to prevent it from snagging at any one point to relieve the tension. So as the belt is twisted and used, the thread, ideally you want that stress being applied over the entirety of the length, or at least as much of it as you can, rather than any one spot. So you're not getting a huge amount of strain as a result of that stress in any one area. That's kind of the idea, at least that's my understanding of it. Because it might not seem like a big thing, but if you imagine you're going to be having the belt like this, rounded, theoretically, this side of the stitch should be shorter than the outside. So what we don't really want to do, at least I don't personally want to do it, is start it straight and then have to try to bend it inwards. And I think those three things together should theoretically mean that we don't have any issues with our thread. Now, I think the rest of the build is pretty self-explanatory, really. I tried to keep to natural materials, traditional materials, if I could. So I wanted the edges to not look too sharp, too clean, especially with the antique finish on the front. So I just used antiquing on those edges so that you're not getting like a perfectly clean colored edge. You're kind of getting a darker edge that almost looks like it's just been burnished over time or something like that is kind of the look I was going for. I then just layered beeswax over those edges to get a nice hard-wearing natural finish. And then finally a decently thick layer of tan coat to seal everything in, protect it over time, and to give it a nice, slightly satin finish. And here we are. So what is the conclusion to this experiment? I think there's definitely improvements that can be made to, the tip, to the consistency of the stamping, to the borders, getting them perfectly in line every time. Like, there are small nuances that you can definitely improve on. I want to try a few different edge finishes and see the best way, the tidiest way to clean those up. Could have definitely done a way better job at keeping the backside clean and free of antiquing that kind of rolled over towards the end there. Not the end of the world, but I wouldn't want to sell this as is. When it comes to process, I think hand stitching is definitely doable. I think we've shown that, but the hours and hours it took, I don't know how long it took, but I definitely, let's just say I could have watched a decent chunk of a Lord of the Rings marathon if I really wanted to. Just dealing with that much thread, I've seen that some people like to do the sides of the belt in sections, but then I didn't want joins going on, so I just kind of powered through it. Ultimately, definitely doable for one-offs, for, if you're making literally one or two of these. Any more than that, if you're ever looking to sell these, you're going to have to get a sewing machine, and I'm definitely going to be getting one myself because I plan to do a lot more projects like this and products like this as well. But going back to the purpose of this video and of this project, it was really to see if on a truly first attempt, you can make something that is passable and, decent enough to be able to say that this is a project worth exploring, worth trying, worth getting into, a skill that's worth learning, and tools that are worth buying. And honestly, I know there are areas for improvement, but I want to say I think this is, personally, I would be happy if somebody gave me this. At the end of the day, if you've never made a hand-tooled belt before and you decided that this would be a good gift for a family member, for a friend, or for yourself, whatever it might be, if you want to get into a new skill, I think what we've shown today is that the barrier for entry to this type of product is perhaps not as high as, at least as high as I thought originally. I've used quite a few different tools in this video because I have them, but if you want to make your own belt, all you really need is a decent knife, a hole punch, and if you're going to stitch it, some pricking irons. And if you want to take that up to a Western tooled belt, then the only additional stuff you're really going to need are a couple of craft tool stamps, which are 10 bucks each Canadian, or 7 or 8 on sale, and a swivel knife for the border. That's really the only difference between this belt and a normal belt. For probably about 100 bucks, you could get into belt making without having any of these other tools that I have around. And, you know, ultimately your material is going to cost you more probably than your tools. But just start off with a 1.5 inch heavyweight veg tan belt blank, somewhere between 8 and 10 ounces. Then just buy a separate kind of 2 inch or 1 3/4 lightweight veg tan belt blank in, you know, 3 to 5 ounces, somewhere in that range. Put the two together and you now have a really nice lined belt. And to help you on that journey, I have provided a link below to my template for creating the ends of this belt. I looked everywhere online. I could not find a free template anywhere. They're all paid. This one is free for those of you that have watched to this point. Just use the code on the screen and you can download that. No strings attached. All I would ask for in return is just please like the video and comment below, get involved. Let me know what you think, because ultimately I also want to leave this a little bit open-ended. That's my opinion about this belt. You might think that this looks like crap. I would be happy for you to tell me that in the comments. Let me know. What I really want is to start a discussion to kind of get people thinking about what is possible, what is doable, and maybe what isn't. Some things might be out of reach for, you know, trying, and I doubt it. I don't see it. Maybe there are things. Maybe we'll discover those as we go along. But honestly, I think a lot of things in the world, leatherworking included, but I think other things as well, are easier or at least more durable than we think. And I think sometimes it just takes an open mind to try those things. So hopefully this video has inspired you to get out there and create something. Honestly, one of the hardest parts about belt making is just getting all the sizes right. So hopefully those templates will help you with that. For my next belt, I want to take this a giant leap further and go into proper hand-tooled floral designs. And that's going to be my first time trying anything like that. So stick around to see what that's going to be like, see how that comes out, and again, see if it's something that you can do without too much practice, without, you know, someone there to teach you. I think these things, there's so much information now online, there's so much information around. I definitely think that these skills are still achievable to this day, and I want to bring those to you, to everybody that watches this channel. And even if you're not a maker, hopefully you just enjoy watching the process. If you want to see that video when it comes up, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell below, because that will alert you to new videos that come out. In the meantime, let me know below what you think about this, whether this has inspired you, whether this has scared you away because of the crazy amount of work that is required to make something like this. I'm really curious to see what the reaction is to this video. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until then, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.